to a joint study session of the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, the Planning Commission, and the Citizens Plan Development Committee. If you're watching on TV tonight, if you look around the room, you'll see that the room is totally reorganized to accommodate this group, but it should be a very rewarding meeting to go through the things that are on our agenda tonight. The things that are on the agenda tonight are to review the updated stormwater management ordinance plan, the floodplain management ordinance, and the Summerlin tax impact study for the planned urban development out on North Jackson Street. So tonight, again, we'll have the Planning Commission, Planned Development Committee meeting, the members of that, and our Board of Mayor and Aldermen. So with that, I'm going to yield the floor to our interim planning director, Mr. Charles Rush, and Charles will introduce the program for us tonight, and we will just announce ahead of time that as a study session, we will not be having comments from the community tonight or public comments. We're all here to learn tonight, to study together, so for those of you in the audience, study and learn along with the rest of us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Rush.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. Like the Mayor said, we're here to discuss the Summerlin project. It's 182 acres. It's a planned mixed-use development. It means that it's going to have multiple stages of retail, as well as single-family homes, townhomes, and townhouses. It's located at 243 North Jackson, parcel number Coffee County 107, 017, 108, and 095. The applicant is requesting to be rezoned to planned mixed use, which will pretty much include 350 single-family detached, 320 multifamily, and 320 apartment styles. We have received the Summerlin TIF analysis from Tom Trent. He will be here shortly, so I'll walk you through it until he gets here. Public Works has estimated that a total of $807,000 will be needed for employees. Police have indicated about $350,000 for police officers, and fire about $1.1 million for additional firefighters. That comes out to about $3.5 million. The proposed TIF right now will actually generate 1.359. Was when we actually reviewed it, the fire department was going to actually grow anyway, so we've halved that, the 1.1 to about 550,000. So it comes down to 1.7 million for all orgs and departments, total cost outside over the 10-year growth. And of course, that'll be a tax estimate of 1.4. And of course, the outside of this will be the 30,000 square foot retail. A density this large will give us the opportunity to bring in additional, opportunities for dining retail, larger, such as Longhorn, Logan's Roadhouse, and such. So that will add additional tax benefits to this, 400, 500,000.
For those of you who are wanting to follow along in your agenda packet tonight, that some of this project starts on page 64 of your packet. So we had them up first so we could get everyone the primary interest for the meeting out of the way first, and then we'll go into the stormwater issues after they present. So excuse me, Mr. Charles, go ahead.
Thank you. That was all I was planning on presenting, so if the applicant's not here, we could move on, I guess, to stormwater first, unless we wanted to talk about the study session for it. He's just running a few minutes late. He said he got stuck in traffic.
Well, are we able to ask
Yep.
you, or are we waiting until?
He was going to present this to us, and then we were actually going to go over it and ask questions to him.
I'll have some for you.
Okay, that's fine.
Do we want to do that after?
No, you can go ahead.
So I guess the question I have is, we do have the total breakdown from the departments on, if it's fully ramped up 10 years down the road, this is what we're going to need for a fully ramped up site, right?
Yeah.
Is it possible to get kind of along the way, to kind of parallel what their phases are, to phase our department's needs with those phases and maybe say, okay, before we get to phase 2, we need to have this department, this is what it's going to add to our annual budget year 1, year 2, year 3, so that we're able to scale department needs with.
Yes, that would be a good idea, because that's what I'm talking about, Sue, our finance director. It's kind of hard to estimate this right now, how they have it broken down. I mean, it's almost impossible. So if we could actually develop that, of course, I mean, depending on the market and how it actually, if it ever actually fully gets developed, but that would be a request that we can make from them.
I mean, because, it would help, right? Because you want to go in right now, year 1, and say, hey, we got to allocate for a 10-acre park for this year. Well, because we don't need that 10-acre park right now. We do need a fire station, but we don't need a year 1. And so it would help us, I think, budget and also say, when we are talking to the public, public's going to see a number of, hey, we're going to need $5 million, and we're going to need 20 employees, and we're going to need this. Well, no. This is how it looks on the timeline and where we need to be. So that's kind of where I'm going with that.
Exactly.
And it's tough, I know, but we can estimate somehow.
Okay, let me interrupt and say, we have a representative from Summerlin here. You're currently on the clock. If you have a PowerPoint presentation that you want to make, we can accommodate that.
Mayor, are we asking, right now, we're just asking questions on just specifically the Summerlin project first?
We would like to get the presentation, and then if we have questions, then we'll ask questions.
Gotcha.
If we could do it that way, I think it would flow much better. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Sorry for running late. My name's Tom Trent. I'm an attorney at Bradley, Aram, Bolt Cummings in Nashville.
Probably got caught in Tullahoma traffic, I guess.
That must have been it. I was a little surprised. It took me 38 minutes to go 4 miles getting out of town, so and it was before 3. Thank you for letting me join you today. My background is I'm an economic development attorney, and I'm used to working on economic impact analysis studies. We do a lot of those in connection with our payment in lieu of tax programs and our tax increment financing programs. And it's my understanding from my client that the community wanted to have an economic impact analysis done for their project. And I understand everybody has a copy. Is that accurate? So I thought it might be just helpful to walk you through it briefly. And as you can see, does everybody have that handy? Anybody need a copy? We're good. All right. I'm going to just start on
66.
Of your materials, I don't know, but it starts with, yes, it starts with economic impact analysis summary. 67, okay. You have that?
We do.
So, and unfortunately, I read these all the time, so they're a little hard to follow sometimes, so I thought it'd be helpful to give you a little overview. But this particular development has townhomes, single-family, multifamily, retail, all adjacent to one another. And the Younger and Associates group does these economic impact studies for people all over. I've probably got a dozen deals right now where they've done them. This one is really pretty interesting because they're showing you that the economic impact just of the construction of this project is about $343 million. That shows about 1,173 direct and indirect jobs. Now, that's a phrase that's a little we don't use that commonly, but direct and indirect jobs include spin-off jobs as a result of money circulating in the community from the wages spent by the people that are employed. Make sense? That's about $61 million of construction wages, and that leads to $2.725 million of direct sales tax. That's from anticipated local spend, and another almost $1 million, $992,000 of indirect spend. So if you get down into the annual impact, you can see that their total is $5,315,000 a year. That's after the project's fully built and up and running. And over a 20-year period, that comes out to $846 million. So that's a very, very significant economic driver for the community. And to me, that's probably the most important thing is working through this summary. We talked about doing a potential TIF. That's really for a later discussion, but when I work on these, I always like to see the TIF analysis too. And the TIF is a tax increment financing which helps pay for the public infrastructure. And in this deal, you can use a TIF or a pilot to incentivize a project and pay for the project itself. This group is not asking for that. It's just to help pay for the public infrastructure components that will go into getting the project up and going. So roads, sidewalks, street improvements, utilities, traffic signals. They can use it for stormwater detention and retention facilities, stormwater management, and parking. Does that make sense? Part of why we do that also is, number one, if you use it for public infrastructure, you don't have to get approval from the state, which makes it faster. And secondly, if it's items that are owned by the city, county, or the utilities, or the state, they don't have to pay income tax on it. It's really your money going to pay for things you own. So this is a way of getting a bunch of infrastructure that is for the community that you don't have to initially pay for. You don't put your credit on it. It doesn't affect your credit rating. You're not liable for it. If something goes wrong and it ends up not getting built in the time frame that they talked about, you don't have any risk. It's all on them. So that's why you're seeing these TIFs being done all over the state right now. We've got 12 of them going at the moment. They're trying to close by year end. And it's because it's a great deal for the community, and it helps the developer kickstart a development and get it done and get your public infrastructure in so that they can spend the money on the rest of the project.
Which of the two numbers is what we would be able to use to build towards infrastructure? Is the 30,000 number, or 30 million to 15 million?
Yeah, great question. That was my next point. So the F in TIF is financing, tax increment financing. And so as you all know, when you go buy a car and you finance the car, you sign the note, and if you end up forgetting to get your insurance and your car gets stolen, you still have to pay the note, right? That's called recourse debt. TIFs under Tennessee law like this are non-recourse debt. So the city, the county, and the Industrial Development Board, or if you do it for healthcare under the Health and Ed Board, you're not liable on it. The developer has to arrange it. So the developer goes and borrows the money and has to pay it back over time. This is set for a 20-year time period. That's why it's run on a 20-year basis. And if we allocate the $30 million of this to the TIF over 20 years, when you discount that back at 6% interest rate, it means you can borrow $15,651,000 up front and pay it back. And that's their risk. But it's through, I explained to people in an elevator speech, a TIF is where we use the incremental increase in property tax created from a project to pay for infrastructure and repay a loan the developer has to get, but you get to own the assets, the public infrastructure. So that's how that's calculated. That's how long, based on all these numbers, that's how long it would take to pay it back at 6%. Yeah, $15 million. Now there's an extra $600,000 they're not worrying about. The other thing I'll point out is that General Eisenhower once said that, plans are not important, planning is. I've also heard he said something like, plans are great until you hit the beach, and then you got to figure out a new plan. Well, these analyses are based on current numbers and current plans. The one thing I know is it won't be exactly this. I want you to understand that. This is static. This is based on today's percentage of dedicated tax. today's property value estimates, today's tax rate, and we all know inflation will kick in. So what happens when inflation kicks in? The property values go up, taxes go up. What happens with the TIF? They're going to cap it at 15 million, so it gets paid back faster. When it gets paid back faster, you get it all back on the tax roll faster. They don't get any more money. They're capping it at the $15 million for the infrastructure. So that's another reason why people like doing these is that, it's a self-affecting, self-regulating, self-monitoring way of doing things because it's their responsibility. It usually gets paid off much quicker. I did one for a road in Dixon between the Walmart and Highway 46, if you know that development, if you've been in there. It's cut off shopping from Nashville West. So we had originally had a plan that showed it was going to take 11 years. It paid off in 7. So it just depends on inflation and what your property tax rates do. But odds are it'll come back substantially quicker. Does that make sense? I've covered all that. It's rather complicated kind of quickly. I want to make sure you're understanding. So obviously this is a pretty good deal for the community because it gets you the infrastructure you need to do a project like this with what we call OPM, other people's money. And it gets paid back with the increment that's created by their project. Under the tax, the Industrial Development Corporation Act here in Tennessee, and there's a Tax Uniformity Act that overlays around it, you have to keep the amount of tax that's currently on the tax roll for this property so it cannot create a hole in your budget. That's important. Number 2, the percentage of the city and county budget that's used for debt service has to be retained by the city and the county. So the increment's really only the amount over that. And in this particular scenario, they're also not taking any of the personal property tax, although technically you can do that. So to the extent there's personal property tax in the stores, for example, in restaurants refurbish every 5 or 6 years, taxes start all over again. You keep all of that, and you get all the sales tax. And the sales tax number here is really rather important. If you look on the summary under retail, the 20-year impact, it's a $357 million economic impact. Creates about 114 jobs. That's not really, retail's not the highest paying jobs. There's a lot of part-time jobs, but they're jobs, and they're stable. That's $54 million in wages, $6.855 million in direct sales tax from these stores. And then indirect sales taxes, again, the respend. They're estimating another $879 million. There'll be permit fees, there'll be, other spin-up, double spinning around property taxes. So this ends up being a very substantial retail sales tax portion. None of that is in the increment. The only increment is the real property tax increase over the current base tax and the portion of your budget that's for debt service. They call that dedicated tax. Heck of a deal. Yes, sir.
Could I interrupt to ask a question about
Absolutely.
the property taxes? As I looked at this, you are referring to the amount of tax increment for both the county and the city.
This is county entity, yes.
So this county is going to forego their collection of property tax
A
on the
portion of
increment
it,
for 20 years?
A portion of it. And if you look at page, let me take you there. And again, we're not necessarily here to talk all about the TIF, but I wanted you to understand how these relate to one another because it gets your infrastructure paid for. If you go to page 15, you'll see a combined, it's 15 of the economic impact fund. I don't know what number that is in your package.
Combined?
Yeah. You find it? It looks like this.
What's the title of the?
It says, the third line at the top under the heading says Combined Tax Summary, Coffee County and City of Tullahoma. That's it.
It's 81.
81.
This is, again, this is not, we're not here to ask for approval of the TIF today, but this was an example that we can work with. They had estimated, the younger people were trying to determine how much money goes to schools. And if you look there, they estimated that the portion of the real property taxes that would go to schools every year based on this would be, come out to $16.5 million over the 20-year period. The amount that would go to debt services, this is combined, $1.6 million. And then the funds allocated to the TIF we already talked about. If you go to the next page, you'll see that broken down by the county, to your question there. And the following page is broken down by the city. This was based on, I believe, Younger's understanding that the taxes, the portion of the county budget that goes to schools is 57.8%. I was talking to Winston, and we're not completely sure that's correct. So between now and when we really talk more about the TIF, we'll get better numbers on that to make sure it's, but the key there is protecting the schools portion of the tax, so you don't have to worry about that. So on this proposal, it's just the incremental increase over the base tax, dedicated tax, and the schools portion. Make sense? Plus, not including personal property, and not including sales tax. Boy, that was a lot in a mouthful, wasn't it? Yes, ma'am.
The question on Coffee County Schools. The Coffee County Schools is exempted from the TIF?
That's what we're talking about.
Okay, what about the Tullahoma City Schools?
Well, that was my point. I'm not sure Younger got the percentages right. I think that's the total for both. And so we will come back when we get more information, but we wanted to illustrate how these work, and this is the best they came up with before today. Make sense? And you have an unusual way of dividing up sales tax, because you have 3 school systems in the county. Many only have one, and I think maybe they thought there was only a county school system, but you have Manchester, Tullahoma, and Coffee County, as I understand it. So we need to figure that out and come back to you on that. But this should be within the range of the totals based on what they did. And so in answer to your question, if the county will be, on this summary, if you look at the Coffee County page, which is the second one, you'll see that the county's, getting over a 20-year period, the new net taxes to the county would be about $28.6 million. $630,000 goes to debt service. They keep $16.5 million would go to schools. And again, we need to divide that up correctly. And then there'd be about $9 million going to the infrastructure costs, which again are public infrastructure. We had in there a 1/4% fee to cover any costs the city, county, or the Industrial Development Board incur in managing this, which are minor. And then covering the public infrastructure that the city that will be put in by the developer, much of which will be owned by the city. So back to the first page, which I think is really the key. You get the economic impact of doing this project really totals about $846 million over 20 years. And after the increment is paid back, if we do the TIF, the most important thing is the project, and then we could work on figuring out exactly how to allocate the TIF. But after you finish repaying the public infrastructure needed to get this project in, all of the money goes to the city, county, and schools. And so that's another reason why these are popular, is because you get them done, you get the infrastructure, somebody else paid for it, it didn't affect your credit rating, you didn't have to put your credit on this, you own the public infrastructure, and once it's rocking and rolling and it gets paid back, all that money's yours. You didn't have to go do a GO bond. That was a lot fast. I've been driving fast too, so I was talking fast, I apologize. So,
Let me
yes, sir.
ask a following question. it seems, one, that we do have a county commissioner here in the audience tonight.
Good.
It seems that with the impact on county taxes, that this would have to go before the county commission as well.
Yes, sir. On the TIF portion, and I understand, the first step is to approve the planning and zoning for the property, but assuming that's approved, the order under the TIF law is we will work with your community on drafting an economic impact plan that designates the economic impact area from which we take the incremental increase in property tax. And that'll be this site and possibly maybe a little retail on either side, we'll see. And then that has to be first approved by the Industrial Development Board after public notice in the paper for 2 weeks and then a public hearing at that meeting. Assuming they approve it, what they do then is refer it to the city and the county approval, because both the city and the county that would be contributing a portion of their taxes to pay for this infrastructure need to approve it. And so it's a several-step process. Often there's committee meetings also that, that people want to have a presentation, and we're happy to come to a PowerPoint on how TIFs work. I've done that for everybody together a few times, if that's helpful. We're at one of those meetings. But so yes, sir, that all happens. We don't need state approval because the state encourages that these funds be used for public infrastructure. They don't want to have to approve it. They believe this is a good use of the money because you're basically using tax dollars to pay for things that are for the benefit of the public.
One follow-up question before I turn it over to the rest of the board.
Yes, sir.
I like the looks of this at the end of 20 years. It looks great. I'm concerned about cash flow to get there. How do you calculate each year how much goes into the payment of the TIF that goes into the infrastructure cost? How do you determine exactly how much that's going to be? And is there an opportunity to pay that off quicker? If the tax increment accelerates, do we pay it off quicker?
Great question. Yeah, and I talked kind of quickly through that earlier. Let me give you an example. We structure it based on a 20-year period because the statute provides for a 20-year tax increment financing without having to go ask the state for permission to go longer. I worked on the big Oracle deal downtown Nashville. The state approved a 25-year deal on that one. I've got another one. They've approved a 30-year deal. We don't need to do that here. 20 years is plenty to cover the $15 million cost. That's why we run these, is to get comfortable that based on 2023 numbers, it works. But what will happen is when inflation kicks in, property values go up, taxes will go up over time. The amount of the funds allowed to go to pay the infrastructure, since we're paying for the infrastructure up front, will be fixed and capped at $15 million. So as soon as that's paid back with the interest, it's paid off, and this is over completely. It's just finished. And our experience is that it's generally appreciably quicker than the time period in these plans because of inflation. They don't take inflation into account. And that's because it's everybody's guess. Now, I have had some developer clients plug in inflation numbers in there, and it looks even much better. But that takes something that's already an estimate and makes it really harder to track estimate. So I think it's easier for all of us to just say, look, based on today's numbers, that this works, and it will only be better than that because of inflation. Does that make sense to you? So that's why on the Dixon deal, it literally paid off in 60% of the time frame that we anticipated. And, everybody was quite happy with that one.
Let me, for housekeeping, let me say that I'm sure that when I open this up for questions, there's going to be 5 hands go up at the same time. What I'm going to take the liberty of doing is taking control of that and recognizing as I see hands go up and try to get people in the order that they go up. I won't do it exactly, but that's the way I'll try to control it. Is that fair game for everybody? Good. Questions? Sellers?
Okay, so I was trying to understand about the bottom line impact early on. One of the things I've been concerned about is the amount of cost of the infrastructure is going to have to go into place pretty early on. Besides roads and such as like the firehouse, possibly schools, how does the TIF funding, is that available to us if we have to build a firehouse immediately? Do we have access to the money to start on that right away? Is that what I'm understanding from the TIF funding?
Well, firehouse is not included within what the statute permits under a TIF.
Right.
So what you would do is use the portion of the increment, the debt service that the community is retaining to help fund those things. And remember, there's all the sales tax revenue. I mean, there's enough sales tax here to pay for a firehouse. So, you know, those in the personal property tax, those are not included in the TIF. It's only the incremental increase in the real property tax over the current tax, the portion of your budget that's debt service, the portion we hold back for schools that goes to pay for this portion of the infrastructure.
Okay.
Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Nice question.
Great question, thank you.
We're going to get to go home early. Alderman Wilson.
So if we needed, kind of piling on to what Mr. Seller said, if we needed new schools, which we will, is that done in the same way as if we needed a new fire station?
Well, to be fair, my client here wanted to make sure that everybody was comfortable because we know you're a community that has great schools. So they were protecting the portion of the budget that goes to schools, and that was my comment earlier about if you look at the Coffee County page that I showed you, they were holding back 57.8% of the county taxes to go to schools. What we learned since Younger did this was that you have 3 school districts. So this probably needs to be divided up among all 3, but that gives, I mean, it's $16.5 million of additional revenue for schools. So that we will have to see how that divides between the city of Tullahoma and the county now that we know that you have your own school system and it's a different amount. But that was the goal. So we have to get into that detail, and that's part of what I'm saying. Look, I don't want you to think you're approving the TIF today. We want to get you better numbers on that.
And would it be available, because I think that we would need schools immediately?
Yeah, well, what you would do, yeah, that's the challenge with the TIF. Let me be clear. The increment does not materialize unless and until they build the projects. And so you've got that time period while they're ramping up the building where there really isn't any increment. And they've got to go figure out how to get the money to pay for the infrastructure up front and then get paid back with the portion that you're allocating to them over time. This is risky for them. And that's why people in your position like TIFs better than things like payment in lieu of tax deals, because it's self-policing. If it doesn't build out on the time frame they anticipated, if it's not as successful as they thought it would be and they don't build it all out, if it doesn't appraise for tax purposes at what Younger estimated, if you have a reappraisal year and these don't go up average, so their taxes go down, there's less to go to pay them back, and they have to pay the difference. That's what non-recourse financing is. You're not responsible for it. The same thing's true on the component that would go to schools, because until they build it and we have the increment, there isn't tax revenue for that. So you probably wouldn't have funds immediately to fund schools, but as they develop the project, it will come. The other part that will be quick is that they plan on doing the retail quite early, and the construction has sales tax as well. So the sales tax will start, it's kind of front-end loaded because a lot of that's from spending money on construction. And so that will come in earlier. But that's not enough to build a school. I don't want to mislead you.
So if
Janie, you're
something happens-
recognized. Excuse me.
Mine's multiple questions. So if something happens that they decide that they're not going to build everything out, what is there any guarantee that we're going to have the amount of schools and fire station and infrastructure that
And what will happen if they're not able to build, let's say we have another COVID recession. I had 2 tips for hotels. COVID hit, everything stopped. They just got put on hold. 2 of them are closing now, this year, and they're getting them going again. But the community had to come back and reapprove it because we put into the plan, and we're not that far here, that they needed to at least start the hotels within 18 months and finish within 40 months. I forget the exact months. And they missed that because of COVID. And so the community, they didn't get any money. Community didn't get any money, but we retooled the deal, and they both have closed now. McMinnville has one of those hotels, and it's now open and running, and everybody's excited about it. But so the answer is, it will have a force majeure provision that covers things like that. If for some reason they get hit by a mail truck while they're getting their mail and killed, it may just die. In which event, whatever infrastructure they put in already is yours, and it's the lender's problem, not yours. So, good news is, somebody picked that up, because you've got this in place. They're putting, this is the kind of thing that once it gets going, becomes of interest to a lot of people. And, they're already working on tenants for the retail. They can't announce any yet, of course, but that'll take on a lot of momentum once that gets going.
just, since you mentioned that, the commercial businesses that would come in, is that something that we would approve first, or?
The way that will work is you go through all the normal planning and zoning discussions, building permits, all of that. Curb cuts, anything like that they will need your approval.
And is that planning commission only, or is that BOMA, or one or the other?
It's a neither, actually.
It's neither.
It's the economic development.
Business in Tullahoma, you can build a business in Tullahoma, we don't say it's.
Whatever your normal rules are apply, is my point.
And lastly, if we need a new substation, like TUA substation, which I'm assuming that we're going to, would that be under the developer? Is that part of the initial infrastructure?
I'm sorry, did you say substation? Power substation?
Power substation.
Yeah. I don't know the details on that, to be fair.
Someone just interrupt to say that in the packet that we got tonight, we have a letter from the TUA that indicates that with this development, they have completely of excess power to provide to accommodate this development without any substation.
Oh, that's
Because
great.
I don't think that that's correct.
And that's from TUA.
Based off of,
Because we actually, all of our power comes from TVA. The only power that we generate ourselves, I think, is
from solar.
4 megawatts from the solar farm. So all of that's TVA driven, and that's contractual. So that's an interesting question. If something happens that TVA doesn't renew our contract, which it could happen, if they, we have a low power rate here, if all of these things that are supposed to be built throughout Tennessee are built all at once, and they're going to have to divert power somewhere within Tennessee, or they could divert power to California. TVA could. The TVA is nationwide, and they can do that.
Scenario where TVA decides the only power source we have, right, provider. There's a scenario where TVA chooses to not give us electricity?
It's a contractual thing, and I think it's every 80. It's a contractual thing, and I think it's every 8 years that's renewed or not renewed.
We should take a field trip to TUA.
Kurt, were you with me when we discussed
This is a
that?
different conversation, but
So anyway, I do have a question for TVA. It'd be nice to have the schools here in TUA for this conversation.
The question has been presented to TUA, and they responded with a letter to the commission that they do have plenty of excess, more than enough excess power. That letter's in the packet.
Thank you.
Next question, Alderman Cheney. Committeewoman Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm interested to know a timeline when everything is approved. When would you begin the commercial aspect and thereafter the residential?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think we have some people here who do.
Hey, I'm Tim Anderson. I'm with Bradford Real Estate, and I represent the developer on the purchase. But typically, he will close on the land, like once he gets his approvals in place, and then he goes for, once all the approvals from planning and the BOMA are approved, then he would go to site plans for the civil work. Once all the civil's in, then we get the building permits. So I would say 120 days after final approval, by the time he would have his plans and maybe be able to break ground. So I'd say about 120 days once we get final approvals before we can break ground.
Okay. So then it might be, like, I mean, things could begin to be in place within a year's time almost, you're saying?
Correct. And I think he's got the phasing plan in the package that we gave at the last planning commission meeting. So there's a phasing plan for the phases, and each one of those would add to the public utility portion of it.
Okay. I'll study this better.
No worries. Thank you.
The next question. Any other questions?
I have one comment, if it'd be helpful.
Sure.
I just want to make sure you understand how the flow of funds works, because sometimes people get confused about that, including my associates. What you do is, and this is another kind of neat thing about a TIF, everybody that's in the TIF plan area just pays the tax they normally would pay. So if I buy a house in a TIF plan area, I just pay my tax like normal. I can appeal it. I can be delinquent and have to get sued to pay it. I mean, it's just like normal. And when the money's collected, the tax collector takes it and pays the county portion pays the city portion, but we'll take the incremental portion that's allocated to this deal for the public infrastructure and give it to the Industrial Development Board, and it will have one obligation, to put it into a bank account in the name, with the bank that makes the loan to the developer or to the IDB, non-recourse, and then once a year, after all the taxes are in there, the bank debits that, pays the interest, and starts paying the loan back. So it's a very simple process. So you'll get your city portion at the normal time you get it. The county gets the county portion at the normal time you get it. It's just the increment that's going to be allocated to the TIF that will go to the IDB, put in an account to repay their loan. Make sense? So it's really, you could see, Have any of you ever done a payment in lieu of tax deal or approved one? Run into those? The documentation for those, I know you've done a number of them, is a book. This is about 5 or 6 pages, pretty straightforward. It sets forth the plan on how this works, and everybody just follows that little roadmap, and it's pretty simple. There's one report a year that's filed, and that's another reason why people like doing these. It is a simple process. And the comptroller in 2012 worked with a lot of our law firms that did this and wrote some legislation that made it uniform across all the agencies that can do TIFs, and there's like 7 of them. And so the rules are essentially the same. So it's much easier than it used to be. So I wanted you to be aware it's no big administrative burden or anything. Okay? It's an exciting project. I'm glad to be here working on it with you.
Any other questions?
I don't have anything for him, but I do for staff.
Go ahead. Any questions for staff?
Thank you. Can you just kind of talk overall briefly, because it is out there on television as well, explain the PUD process and how that kind of differs and...
The PUD process is just pretty much rezoning. It's a normal rezoning. The only thing that you're actually including with that is what kind of rezoning and what for. This will, of course, be a planned mixed use, so it'll have a retail element in there. And you're allowing to have their own pretty much unique zoning. So it throws out all the density requirements that we currently have. Right now, what is it? I think they're proposing 996 units for that, and so you lock them into the density to those units, and then also the design standards that they choose, whether it's brick or whatnot. That is the first stage of it. That'll go, of course, to the Planning Commission, and then that will go to the BOMA for 2 readings, and if it's approved, and then it will go to the next stage if it's just, that's the normal standard, that there's not any additional conditions that are being put on them.
And so the difference is kind of in the beginning process, right, where we can make a little more, not demands are not the word, but negotiate
Conditions.
with them because of the higher density, right?
Correct.
Kind of. So we could do things here that we couldn't in a normal standard Euclidean and say, you know, hey, we'd like you to have X amount of open space here, or we'd really like you to have, or we're not going to vote for it if you don't, you know, that type, you don't want to say it in that way. But hey, we'd like you to put the houses on this side and apartments over here because it matches what's on over this area. Where we really can't do that in a normal scenario. An R, so just like a straight R, and then that becomes part of an ordinance, right? Once you give those conditions, that's part of law.
So that's part of it that you're actually approving it with, if you make it with those conditions. So let's just say if you make it with the TIF approval, if you make it with the traffic study, will be triggered right away on Ledford Mill and also North Jackson. And let's just say if they were agreeing, which they have, to a fire hall somewhere to buy that, wherever the fire department chooses, those would be conditions. And then you continue on the, Planning Commission and also BOMA, and they'll approve those. And then they'll follow up with those conditions before they come back with the preliminary plats to the Planning Commission.
I got a couple more, and I'm asking somebody, they were sent in by residents, and so I do want to ask why we, so say in between, I guess kind of a twofold, in between these phases, say we agree on kind of timelines for phases, say you get in between, well, one, do we have input on the phases and say, hey, before you could start phase 2, we want a checkpoint in there to make sure that, yes, we've got the infrastructure in place, or yes, or maybe we want you to spread it out.
Yes, so that would be in the construction phase. That would be staff that actually approves that. That would be myself, Scott St. John, Public Works. So we would all get together and make sure that that's been followed through with. And of course, they would put a bond up and everything else, just like your normal standard procedures.
Okay. and it came up in conversations here for two of the questions. One of the reasons that I was in the beginning asking about, can we maybe put the city's timeline, build line, once maybe it gets a little further, but we may need it sounds like, in order to prove, because there's questions around this, we're not going to need school day one. We're not going to need to build day one, year one, because your residential's first, or not residential, commercial's first, I believe in that plan. But what we, to answer kind of some of those questions is, hey, no, common sense says we don't need this, we don't need this. But we do need to be paying for it, because year 3, we're going to be open, or year 2, we're going to be selling homes, and there's going to be bodies in here. And so that's what I was kind of looking for at the beginning, was kind of answer the questions that were asked here, because that's, I think, going to keep coming up as a recurring. So that would be, I know that's a big feat, but I know it can be done, because I read it in other, and maybe we hire the same guy to do it. Would it be beneficial at all to hear from, because it is a study session, to hear, and he may not want to, but to hear from the chairman of the Economic Development Board? I don't want to put you on the spot, but this seems like a good, appropriate.
You're not on the spot, but you're on.
Particular questions, or you want me to make some comments?
How do you feel about it?
Okay, I'll make just a couple comments, and I'll take questions and limit answer, because I haven't had as much time to study this. I have read through the packet that was sent, but I haven't had time to really sit and digest the numbers. So we've done a TIF before in Tullahoma. We did the Tullahoma Mall, or the Northgate Mall, how many years ago? 2018. And so we've been through this process before. We've worked with Tom before, and appreciate you coming down, Tom, again. And so, that process we've been through once. There's been some changes in state law, I'm sure, since then, so we'll have to walk through it. But the general process, and with the Northgate Mall, we've considered it to be a very successful redevelopment of the mall. And it helps them with their financing to, like I say, get it up and running. And in our case, the sales tax revenue that we have gained from the development that has happened, and this is one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet I want to mention. So when we did the mall, at the time we would have been allowed to draw a larger area to include in the TIF. But one of the things that happens is when we built out the mall, I shouldn't say we, when the owners of the mall built out the mall, all the property around the mall became more valuable. Right? In some cases, you can draw lines to include some of that in your TIF, but I don't think you guys are proposing that. I don't know what the state law is now. You can do it, but they're not. But you all are not proposing it at this time. But we could choose to try to. We could ask some questions along the line. And the other thing is, you not only get the benefit of the sales tax from that property, but you're going to get the additional sales tax. I mean, just look across the street from Northgate. None of that was there before the TIF, right? We've been discussing for some time now in the Economic Development Board the need for the next increment of retail, and obviously everything between the Franklin County to the movie theater is pretty much full in terms of space. And so we've been talking about what could we do to promote growth at that end, because every retailer that we hear from, they want to be on Jackson Street. We try to say, well, why don't you go on 55 down there on the way to the base? And they're like, we want to be on Jackson, right? That's where the traffic count is, and that's what's important to them. So you can probably pretty much guarantee that if we build this facility with retail at that location, we're going to immediately expand the demand for retail development in that area. And so hopefully we're going to get even more benefit in that regard. So I just want you to keep that in mind. What was the other thing I was going to mention? Oh, there was the mayor mentioned the county commissioner, so that's me. I am chairman of the budget committee for the county right now. We also got approval of the last TIF through the county, and I was the one that made the presentation to the county commission at the time as the chairman of the board of the TADC. I was not a commissioner at that time. They did at that time restrict the length of the term for the county term to less than the city's term, so which did affect the TIF to some extent. We have a pretty different commission now. I I won't stand here and predict to you how the commissioners will react to that at this time, but I will go start having conversations with the mayor and some of the budget finance, our finance director at the county, and start giving them a heads up that this is being discussed and get their feedback. I think somebody kind of hinted at, well, why would the county care? And I think Mr. Trent answered that to some extent. It's going to be more money for the county school systems. My personal opinion has always been, it was then, it is now, and always has been, that citizens of Tullahoma are also citizens of the county. And therefore, as a county commissioner representing the citizens of Tullahoma, something that's good for Tullahoma is good for the county, and I'm going to advocate for it if it makes sense for the city of Tullahoma. And the county as a whole gets some benefit as well, in additional jobs, additional people. I mean, that money doesn't just stay stuck inside the city limits of Tullahoma. So that'll be a conversation we'll have to have with the county commission, but I'm certainly willing to engage that conversation. Any questions for me?
Sure, Mr. Sellers.
Yeah, since you've been involved in this before, I'm curious, we've made concerns about the need for schools, firehouses, extra police cars and such. Is it your opinion, based on what you're seeing here, that you feel like that the cost of those will be covered by the income that's brought in here, and it would not be a property tax increase to the existing citizens?
So let me say a general comment about that, because first of all, I don't know exactly how those numbers work out. I've asked that question myself multiple times over the years about how much growth, one of the big questions is, does growth pay for itself? Does growth pay for itself, period? And people have different opinions about that, right? And it's awful hard to get a number to prove that one way or the other. I think your question is not really a question specific to this particular project as much as is a question about, do we want growth in Tullahoma at all? If we want growth, then eventually those expenses are going to come, right? If we want to grow, eventually we're going to have to build a new school. But I've been living here for 33 years now, and we've yet to build an additional school. We've replaced a couple, but we haven't built an additional one. And I have been looking at, so on the county side, we've been doing a strategic plan I've been involved in, and so I've been looking at that. Coffee County, or Tullahoma, in the last 30 years has had an annual growth rate under 1%. But in the county now is seeing the growth, and you all know this. We're seeing the growth overflow out of Nashville and out of Murfreesboro. It's coming into Beech Grove area. It's coming into Manchester heavy. Manchester is now growing much faster than Tullahoma. And I just want to caution you that if we try to restrict growth too much, we could end up in a situation where retail follows houses. And if we start allowing Manchester to grow much faster than us, we're in danger of our retail moving to Manchester on the interstate. And in addition to that, we are so dependent on our sales tax. And our economic board talks about that all the time. We really wish we could figure out a way to get industry in here in addition to just retail, but we are limited in our real estate that's available to develop industry in Tullahoma. So that's, unfortunate depending on how you look at it. And, nobody wants a factory right in their backyard, but there's all that. And in addition to that, most people, I think, are starting to become aware there are a tremendous number of new jobs coming to Coffee County in the very near future. ADC has $2 billion of investment coming that is going to go towards additional construction of test facilities. As an I3 engineer sitting right in her office, we're working on a major test facility right now. And when that thing becomes active and there's additional facilities become active, and they're going to be adding more shift, and the commander will tell you, there's no joke, that money's coming. We're building stuff right now, and those jobs are going to come because we're trying to catch up with China. When our community council visited the Pentagon this spring, we had a meeting with the general in charge of the entire Air Force, the chief of staff, and he made it clear in no uncertain terms that they are serious about getting caught up, and that AEDC plays a major role in that. Those jobs are coming. I can't tell you how many. The commander gave me a number, but he didn't give a number that could be shared publicly. But it's a lot. And then on top of that, the I-24 industrial site, the state is going to close the purchase of that site in the very near future. And we're going to have a very large industrial development on the north side of Manchester in the next few years. Those jobs are coming to Coffee County. The commander expressed we met with the commander at the county to talk about development and things, the needs that the commander had. And the commander stated that their biggest concern, and they actually did a survey for us of their workforce. The number two things, the two biggest comments that they got that they want to see out of our community as a whole, and Tullahoma has always been supportive of the ADC community, is they need places places for workers to live because they're hiring new couples and new young engineers and new craftsmen, and they're all living in Murfreesboro, and they're getting tired of trying to get down I-24 every day. But there's no place, not only in Tullahoma, but in Coffee County, where they're having trouble finding any place to live. And secondly, childcare is becoming a real issue for the ADC workforce because it's awful hard when you're there on base to find. If you live in Murfreesboro and you leave your kid in childcare in Murfreesboro, that's not inconvenient. That's pretty inconvenient when you get that call because your kid's got an upset stomach, right? So all these things together, and I know people worry about growing too fast, but like I say, our growth rate has been under 1%. A 1%, we've been close. 1%, we've got like 8,900 residences in Tullahoma right now. So 1% means we need like 90 a year to stay even with where we are. If we grew 2 or 3% for a few years, would it be the end of the world? But we will, if we grow, do that. But if we don't grow, we're at risk of drifting backwards the other way, losing the retail that we have, and then we won't be able to afford our nice school systems and that. So I think it's paramount for this group to think carefully about restrictions we want to do, what we want to, whether it's this project or another project. I'm all for, and I've had this discussion with friends I work with and multiple people now. I made a presentation Rotary a few months ago. I'm all for understanding people don't want a particular development next to their house. I get that totally. But I think what we can't do is say because of that, we can't develop anywhere in the entire city. And so I would just ask you to consider those things. So there's really two concerns here, I think, what growth is, what expenses are going to be driven by growth if we build this facility? And then also just, will it pay out? How does it pay out? But from everything we've seen, people want to come to Tullahoma. Businesses want to come to Tullahoma. So let's figure out an appropriate way to protect ourselves, protect our citizens from, the inconveniences of that as well as we can. But let's not choke growth back. We could end up in a bad place in the next 5-10 years if we do that. That's my speech, sorry.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
And thank you for that explanation. That was very helpful. When do you think, did the commander give you any idea of when we might know, when we'll know about how many jobs and what type of jobs? Are they going to be permanent jobs, or are they going to be just
the
short-term?
construction, there are some short-term. I asked him that same question when I met with him about 6 months ago now. I really don't want to give numbers in public. I'll tell you in private if you want. Because I don't have his permission to do that. But there's a lot of construction going on right now. There are some temporary jobs, and that'll go away. But the intent is to have multiple facilities, new facilities, fully operational, that will employ the entire task force for that. And in addition, increasing the shifts on some of the existing facilities, and perhaps adding some new types of work. That will be a combination of probably about like it is now at ADC of engineering, technical workforce, and skilled labor. And there's a significant part of both, which is also why we need a new TCAP facility, which the state has us scheduled to have, that we're also going to have, because we need to think about training as well for all this workforce. And let me add one more thing. Right now, with the housing situation, we hear continually from young engineers we're hiring, and I hear from parents my age whose kids want to move home that they can't find a place to live. And my question is, where are our kids going to live? I realize everybody likes nice houses. A starter house in Tullahoma is $300,000, and the interest rates are 7%. A new kid coming out of school to be a fireman, a police officer, a nurse, or a teacher in our community is going to be making $50,000 to $40,000 to $50,000. They cannot afford a $300,000 house, and there are no apartments for them to rent. So that's now. Appreciate y'all letting me make my speech. Any other questions for me? I'll stop pontificating.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. If there are no other questions, are there any other questions? Let me ask from any commissioners in the committee. If not,
No questions about the TIF proposal, but I was wanting to know if we were going to discuss amongst us some of the issues or, things that we would propose to the developer for this development. I've had conversations with several people about concerns on travel coming onto Ledford Mill Road, for instance. So one of the things, when I looked at this, I wondered if there was a way that we would possibly consider making a suggestion to the developer that, as opposed to having, for the single-family dwellings, one exit onto, one entry on and off of 41 and one off of Ledford Mill, but to add a second one on the opposite side of the property onto 41, that would relieve the possible congestion going to Ledford Mill. So are we going to discuss any of that here amongst us as a working group, or, leave it till the Planning Commission meets? I'm just curious about how we're going to talk about this.
I see two entrances off Highway 41 on this.
The one entrance that goes into the multifamily is supposed to be a gated area so that it's not accessible from the rest of the residentials. Right.
Yeah, it'll have to have another entrance there.
Well, so they show one entrance in here to this area. They have one entrance to this area and one down here, but what I was saying is if they, over there where the Phase 6 residential is, if they were to put a second entrance along that side, on the opposite side of the development, then that would separate the two entrances to the single-family dwellings, and it would possibly relieve some of the congestion that would go out onto Ledford Mill. I've driven out through there, and it's a pretty narrow road. I think there is a plan to expand or modify that road, is that right? Ledford Mill? When is that going to happen?
To the airport. It's actually included right now. We're at the environmentals at the bridge. We're held up, and then we'll put it out for bid.
Yeah, I don't, what I would love is for planning and BOMA to be on similar pages, right? And not, I hate to go all the way through, a month of the PC, and then it gets to BOMA, and then we restart. And that was, I think that I had originally called for this study session when I was on the Planning Commission. I had to leave y'all. I don't miss you yet. But that was sort of the intent when I had called the planning session, study session, was so that we could have some of those collaborative, we can't discuss, but we could toss out ideas, so that way it's not just, we get here, then we get to Bowman, and it's like, nope, we don't like any of this, and then we've just wasted everybody's time. Not wasted,
This is a study session, right? Supposed to talk amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, let me open this up to the two commissions, the board and the planning commission for this very thing. And I think one of the things that is quite helpful for the planning commission, certainly, for any of the people in codes, is to get input from the board, and to get input while we're here is fine to do that. So anything that anybody on the planning commission cares to add about this development that's not been fully vetted already tonight.
I have a question too, and I'm not sure who would answer it.
Is there anything from the planning commission?
Mayor knows I don't have anything specific. I was just open up discussion for the same thing that you were, but.
I was just curious, and I'm not sure who would be able to answer this, but in looking at kind of like the conceptual plans, I mean, you can kind of guess, single-family housing and multifamily, townhomes. But in the apartment part, do we have any idea of how many actual units would be in the apartment phase or part of that? Does anybody know?
320.
It's in the plan. Memorized, it's in the plan.
320 multi-rate, market rate multifamily homes on 24 acres.
320?
It's on page 143.
Thank you. And I know that it had been mentioned that there might be, that they might be brick. There was mention too of being like a mix of brick and things.
Page 144.
What's that?
Page 144.
And that was my suggestion, to them, asking that question, if they could be, since this is going to be what's going to be visible when you come into Tullahoma, I asked if they could do brick instead of the cement and whatever that fair fiber, whatever
Right.
terminology is. And they said, I thought they said that they had planned to do that, although it's not in the plan that we have.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So that's what my question was, is if it was going to be brick, or if it was going to be, what that was going to be.
Yeah, best I remember, they said that they would still use the fiber cement board as well as the brick. So they would use masonry products is what they said, which the fiber cement was included, which still builds a better home than, a vinyl or maybe a wood structure or wood veneer.
And then, and what, as far as privacy things, was it going to be fencing, evergreen screening, combination,
I also asked that question about using evergreen type to border for the properties that are behind. They agreed that that's something they typically do.
Is to use the evergreen?
To use a green boundary for privacy from adjacent properties.
Yeah, those are not things I think that they guaranteed. They said they kept using the term they normally do. It wasn't a guarantee, so if that's something that we want to do.
That's what we'd like to see.
We need to put that, say this is what you have to do.
And those are the types of things that we would have control over, or on the planning
Best I understand.
Those would be the conditions that you actually put with the approval, the process.
Yeah, that's my question too that I had, is on the PUD type of development, we would be able to negotiate all these things that we've been talking about here, the construction of the houses, the materials used, the screening, the extra entrances off of Jackson Street. Are those all things that are negotiable during this process that we could work out and have a level of comfort with? Is that how this works?
Yes, you could actually make that additional requirement if that's what you wish.
It has to be done. It has to be done when we meet as a planning commission.
And then it would go in front of
the board can also add to or take away from our suggestions, but it has to be done by us for next meeting when we consider this, and then on the two meetings that you all have.
We can have that discussion tonight.
Yeah, that's why I was wanting to have this, try to come up with those ideas.
Well, all the things that were mentioned to me seem like good ideas. The additional entrance off Jackson is definitely a good idea, I think. And to take relieve some traffic off of Ledford Mill Road. And then also, I think the screening and the materials and the architectural appearance of the buildings, I think, is an important thing, too.
I'd like to recognize our city administrator for a comment.
Just something briefly. I know in my conversations that I've had with Mr. Rush and a few others, it's my understanding that the developer is very open to working with the Planning Commission, with the Board of Mayor and Aldermen in creating something that we're going to be very proud of. And so I just want to make sure that it's understood that based on some things I've heard that could be on the table that they would offer, I think this is something that we should really look at as far as not only developing, but having that understanding that they're going to be very amenable to trying to meet the needs of what we think our citizens need over the next 20 to 50 years.
Any further comments? Comments from the PDC? Land Development Committee?
Just a quick note on what Mr. Sullivan was saying. I kind of looked back through the YouTube of I'd looked back through the YouTube of the meeting where the PUD was presented by the developer, and Mr. Seller's question was specific to possibly using brick as a predominant feature on the exteriors. And my impression from the gentleman, I think his name was Mr. Rudd, I don't know if I've got that pronunciation correct, was that that's something that they essentially usually do, but that's not really what the pictures represented. So, or what's in the proposal. So, I mean, once again, my understanding is that's the kind of thing that the PC and/or BOMA, the exterior elevations, things like that, you can put into play. I guess they don't have to agree to it, but that's the negotiation part. I know that I think everybody would like to see something really nice out there. So, just my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Further comments?
One thing I wanted to bring up is,
Commissioner Rice.
one thing I wanted to bring up was, does anybody have any ideas, I don't have any particular, on should we allow them to have the full density that they're asking for? Should we require them to decrease the density? That's one thing I'd heard from some people. Do we want to allow the full density? That's another thing that we can, best I know, regulate. We can cap it at 800 people or so if we wanted to. I wanted to know if anybody else had ideas on that.
I'd only comment on that, and Mr. Trent can correct me as far when I get out of line, but of course the economic impact study was based on the density that's presented. So we have to regrind the sausage, I think, if we change the density. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Well, and I would try to, ask, I would say, first, yes, that is something that we, if I was talking to, I would say, yeah, I would think that that's something we can do. What's the driver? What would be the reason that we want to reduce it from 996 to 800, or is it concern for, infrastructure? Is it concern for schools? Is it that? And then is that the right approach, right? Is 100 people really going to make that big of a difference, or is there, because at some point, I think when it comes to, we'd have to crunch the numbers again, right? There are these break-even points. So maybe you reduce that by 196 people, and then that 800 people ends up not paying for everything that, you wanted to, and you kind of hurt yourself there. There's lines that would intersect, and so that would be, I don't know that 100 people makes that big of a difference, right? Because it's all based off of, except for the major infrastructure pieces, roads, you're going to pay the exact same amount of money regardless of who's there. You'll pay more down the line in maintenance.
Mr. Rice, are you actually, when you say 800, just as a number, are you talking about units?
Yeah.
Because people is a different, it's not 800 people.
I meant units, right?
Okay.
So, but units is what we're talking about, right? So if you reduce it by 800 units, that's what our money's based on. Property tax and those pieces, sales tax and stuff, obviously.
The taxes, but I mean, that's traffic.
Like that, but.
Paving, and that's.
Yeah, so, but when we're talking about units, that's what we're kind of basing off of paying things for. So that would be my question to somebody that asks that is, what's the driver? What's the reason? Why would we want to do that? Not why would we want to do that, but why do you want to do that?
Yeah, I think it would actually be interesting to know what the difference would be in just 100 units. That would be an interesting thing, since they have to redo the school information anyway. That might be worth just seeing a number.
How much does one of these studies cost to do?
I have no idea. I just order them.
Well, most of the study's done. I mean, they would just have to tweak based on 100's a nice round number.
Yeah, and it would depend on where you took that 100 from. Did you take it from the mixed use? Did you take it from the single home, family home, or whatever it was?
Or the apartments, or the
I think you could leave that up to them. You could say, it would be this density, and then they can allocate it as.
I think my question would still be, why? 100 is an arbitrary number, right? Why not 150? Why not 200? Does 100, for them to ask them to go back and not redo, right? Start with their base point. And it's not to you, right? This is just a general why. That's such an arbitrary, and in the long scheme of things, what does that actually do for us.
No, it may not be beneficial, but I wanted to bring it up as a topic and see if anybody had any
I think it's a good point. And I mean, because there is a lot of risk.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of benefit if it all works smooth. And I think that it would be a great, it looks great. But there's also a lot of risk if it doesn't work the way that we hope it does. So it would be nice to see I don't know what number to plug out. 100 less seems like a good number.
Well, because it could be that 100 that puts TV over the point to not renew our contract. I'm just kidding. I have some questions on this, if the planning commission is, I do see two entrances.
I'm mistaken. I thought that the second entrance next to
Would be closed?
was part of the closed area, and I see that at the other end now.
Okay, so we have clear.
But also, Charles, as I'm talking about, the gated area has to have a second entrance, and they would have a second gate, so that they would have two entrances into the gated area. And he said they were going to add, that's not on there, but it would be just after you come into A on the Shelbyville side, there would have to be an entrance in there that'd also be gated, so there'd be two entrances out of the gated area.
Okay. Nice. So that would be three, technically, one gated.
Yeah.
I do see, and I haven't dug in yet, I'm going to go meet with a lot of folks, and I'll get a lot more questions. There is concern about the Ledford Mill Road. I know one of our projects is in widening Ledford Mill Road, and that's because of the anticipated growth, right? I guess is my twofold question. One, say, we cut that Ledford Mill exit off, and we say, hey, we're not really wanting to grow in this area. Does that make the widening project worth doing? If we just want to shut it down and leave it to all the traffic that's kind of there. The other is the concerns that I've had, because that's where you've actually kind of got people who have their homes already. And like what I would say when the developer kind of comes is one of the things that I would want you to consider is while we can't completely match, and this is something that you keep saying, we can't, and I agree with your point, we can't completely always match everything, but if we can at least, if you got a single family home there on 5 acres, and then we throw a bunch of
Quarter-acre lots.
townhomes, I think M is the multifamily residential, so that's probably going to be townhomes or duplexes. A is an entry, B is just a public street.
I think on that Ledford Mill exit, it's just single-family dwellings all through there,
So,
even down to Phase 4, but they are backing up against it. And that's why I was asking.
well, there's a little M right there in the corner. At the back, right in here, at the very end.
That's not a multifamily, though. That
M
was not
says-
multifamily. It doesn't say what it is, but I think it's just a green area.
Yeah, it should have originally been a park, it was just omitted by
My
accident.
glasses aren't working.
Yeah.
I had that, I was looking at the A. So what is M? Oh, it's open?
It's just a green area.
So there's really no structures except for D.
Right. And they're all single families.
Yeah, and they'll all be single family.
They're 50-foot width, so that's not very much. I don't know if there's any homes over in this side.
That would be my concern. I need to go out and look at it, but, if we do, then you'd already brought up evergreens or some way of blocking, and that may be enough.
I mean, it will help. It will
help.
make people happy, but it'll help, I think.
I'm just also, there's some sort of formula about parks per amount of people. I didn't see that in here. Is that in here? Or
10.8 or 10.9 acres per 1,000 people.
Christina, you recognized? You recognized?
And is that in here?
Yeah, it's in the third. There's a whole huge
Our
section.
committee has been working on transportation recently, and I guess my concern is about talking about jobs at AEDC and jobs in Manchester on I-24. My concern is maybe, 1,000 more vehicles trying to get from 41A on the other side of town all the way out to AEDC and to Manchester. Are we going to look at possibly putting some kind of road through so that it doesn't have to, everything doesn't have to go down Jackson Street? Because that's a concern as we grow, that everything has to go down Jackson Street. We're actually looking at putting a turn lane, I guess, Chuck, on Atlantic Street, potentially. That could be an alternative for us since it runs parallel to Jackson, but that's got to be something that our group and the Planning Commission and BOMA take into account. It's all the cars that are going to be traveling down that road to get to work.
Other comments? It's hard to sit around a table and design a 1,000-unit development, sit around a table living. I think we've done a pretty good job tonight of getting opinion expressed. And for our planning director, I think you take everything that we've got, go back to the developer with these comments. And with that, since there's no other question, I want to thank everyone for their cooperation tonight, for being here and expressing their opinion and meeting on relatively short notice from getting the detailed plans that we've gotten. So at this time, I'm going to adjourn for a 5-minute break, and we'll go into the stormwater section after the 5-minute break. study session, and we'll go into the portion on the stormwater review and the floodplain management plan. So with that, Charles Russell, the interim planning director, that'll probably introduce the participants representing tonight. So, Mr. Rush, it's up to you.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'll go ahead and introduce Scott St. John.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Real quick.
If you could, please use your microphone, please.
Okay. And is it working? Can you hear me?
Hello?
Thank you, Scott. St. John Engineering. Good. Thanks for allowing us to be here tonight. We're going to go over changes to the stormwater ordinance and an update on stormwater. We'll introduce Jim Patterson with our company Takeover. Jim is the co-owner. He's our environmental manager. And he works with other municipalities as well regarding stormwater regulations on stormwater quality as well as quantity.
Thank you again for letting us be here tonight. I'm going to start by, before we get in, we do have a PowerPoint presentation. You can get a copy of that if you want to make any notes or anything. But I want to give a little bit of background as to why we're here, how we've gotten here to this point. Many of you, I think, have seen me do a stormwater presentation here in Tullahoma in the past. In fact, I believe this is the 4th presentation I've done on this topic here in Tullahoma, going back to 2010. So I'm going to explain a little bit about why that is. You know, we've been talking about the stormwater quality, post-construction stormwater quality requirements since 2010. And what that means is, when I say post-construction stormwater quality, you know, we regulate stormwater during construction, you know, with the silt fences that you see and sometimes sediment basins, you know, those type sedimentation controls. Post-construction stormwater quality is permanent. After the construction process is over with and the development is there permanently, the only stormwater controls that are permanent right now are quantity controls, meaning detention basins. This will require permanent stormwater quality controls. And, you know, that's a very different animal. The reason we've been talking about this since 2010 but have not implemented this yet is because TDEC has been literally tied up in lawsuits over these requirements since 2010 when they first tried to implement these in the municipal permits. So we have waited. Most cities, now some cities went ahead and jumped the gun and implemented these requirements, and now many of those cities are having to go back and change their requirements. So Tullahoma chose, along with most municipalities, to wait until TDEC got through all of those lawsuits and got these things settled before implementing these requirements. So that has literally taken 12 years at this point, but we are there now. And the floodplain ordinance that you have in front of you is kind of related, but it's really not. So I'm going to explain, you know, why you're being hit with both of these at this point in time. Historically, here in Tullahoma, and this goes back since the original stormwater ordinance, the floodplain requirements here in Tullahoma have been embedded in the stormwater ordinance, and they're that way today. If you look at your current stormwater ordinance, your floodplain requirements are embedded in that ordinance. Your current ordinance is a 2012 ordinance, was the last time any changes have been made to the stormwater ordinance. Late in 2019, the city manager asked me if I could separate those two documents, make the floodplain ordinance a standalone ordinance. I did that. I drafted the ordinance that you have in front of you. At that time, actually submitted it to the city in January of 2020. And as a result of that, we had to modify the stormwater ordinance at that time also, just to take the floodplain requirements out of it so that you didn't have a duplication. While doing that, we did change the format of the stormwater ordinance a little bit, just in response to a TDEC audit that we had had. TDEC made a comment that parts of our ordinance were a little bit hard to follow as far as the standards. So we modified the format a little bit to separate construction standards, post-construction stormwater quantity standards, and then post-construction stormwater quality standards. There were no quality standards at that time, but we knew they were coming, so we went ahead and put that section in there and just said, you know, this section left blank intentionally at this time, or something to that effect. So I say all that to say, if you took the ordinance that you have in front of you right now, the stormwater ordinance, and compared it to your current 2012 ordinance, you'll see other changes other than what is in red in this ordinance. But those changes are just in formatting. They don't change any of the actual requirements. So what you see in the draft ordinance in front of you in red are the only actual substantial changes where we are changing requirements or adding, and it's really adding requirements more so than changing. These ordinances do not have to be approved by the Planning Commission. The reason the city wanted to do this in this joint session is because it certainly does impact the Planning Commission. Not so much that you have any say-so over what is in this ordinance, but some of what we're going to talk about tonight. You may have developers come to you and want to see a change to subdivision regulations or zoning in trying to comply with those requirements. And that'll become a little clearer, kind of what I'm talking about there as we get into the presentation. So with that being said, I don't know if you have the PowerPoint. All right. So what we're talking about here really is just specifically the stormwater ordinance. Where do I need to point this to? There we go. So what you see here is the City of Tullahoma's, this is the cover sheet of the City of Tullahoma's current permit that they have from TDEC. You'll see the effective date circled there at the bottom. This current permit became effective January 1 of this year. All right, there we go. All right, those of you that attended the stormwater presentation that we did at the high school, I guess a year and a half ago, we talked about all of these 6 control measures that are in your stormwater permit. We are only talking about item number 6 tonight, the post-construction stormwater management. I touched on this in the introduction there when we talk about permanent stormwater management or post-construction stormwater management. 2 aspects to that. Stormwater quantity, which is your detention, stormwater quality. What the draft ordinance that you have in front of you, we have not made any changes whatsoever to the stormwater quantity portions of that ordinance. What's been in there for many years now is what's in there now. Stormwater quality is what we have added new standards for. So these next couple of slides, these are directly from the city's stormwater permit. This is TDEC stating what the city must do to comply with the permit. And the first one there, you see the permittee, that's the City of Tullahoma, shall develop and implement a permanent stormwater management program to reduce pollutants in stormwater discharges through management practices, control techniques, systems, design, engineering practices, implemented to the maximum extent practicable. And that's an important term, that MEP, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides, but that derives directly from these lawsuits that TDEC has settled. Next item, the permanent stormwater management program shall include plans, reviews, site inspections, and a means to ensure that permanent stormwater control measures are adequately operated and maintained. The city already does all of that for the stormwater quantity. They'll just now be adding stormwater quality to that as well. Item C, and I've got it in red because that's what we're actually doing here tonight. The permittee must develop and implement and modify as necessary an ordinance or other regulatory mechanism to address permanent stormwater management at new development and redevelopment projects. And then the last item, the permittee must submit an implementation plan for its permanent stormwater management program not later than 90 days after the effective date of the first new or revised permit issued after the effective date of Tennessee rule, blah, blah, blah. The implementation plan, the most important part there at the bottom, shall include a timeline to develop and implement the program. And what TDEC did in this, and they did this not so much in the permit, but through several seminars and meetings that they had on this permit when it was still in its draft form, and pretty well let all the cities know that, hey, this has been floating around since 2010. For you existing MS4s, this really shouldn't take more than a year for you to implement this. We will give cities 2 years if you can give us a really good reason why you need it, but we don't expect it to take more than a year. So when Tullahoma submitted its implementation plan, and this is just the cover of that, it was submitted as required back November of last year. That document did say that the city of Tullahoma would implement this program within 1 year of the effective date of the permit. You saw the effective date of the permit in one of the first slides as being January 1st, 2023. So we have until January 1st, 2024 to implement this program. And that's basically just a matter of getting this ordinance approved. Once that ordinance is approved, then any new developments that come in, will have to comply with those standards.
I have a question. Will we have to develop water quality testing to test it for chemicals or things, or no?
No, and it's, you do have some monitoring requirements now that you have to do. It's more about, it's not chemical type testing for the most part, it's stream evaluations that have to be done. None of that is changing, and it's really, for the most part, these standards are on the developer. It's really not
Construction standards mostly?
Well, they'll have to, and you'll see a little bit of this further in this presentation, they'll have to put in a water quality element along with their detention. And in a lot of cases, what this is going to end up being is an extended detention basin.
Mechanical filtration type of
Well, it can be mechanical. A lot of times what they'll do and what TDEC prefers, and you'll see in the standards where they've actually given incentive to doing infiltration, that type of thing. You'll see an infiltration basin, a heavier detention basin, something along those lines. It really, for the most part, all of this is on the developer, with the exception of the planning commission. We're going to get into requirements here, or the idea of runoff reduction. And I'm going to hold off and not get into
Right, sorry, I didn't mean to stop you there.
So the standards, and this is very technical, so I'm going to go through this briefly, but I don't necessarily expect everyone to fully understand this, but there are a couple of terms in these standards that are meaningful. So the permanent stormwater management program must require new development and redevelopment projects to be designed to reduce pollutants to the maximum extent practical. That's that MEP term again, as set forth herein. Compliance with permanent stormwater standards for new development and redevelopment projects is determined by designing and installing stormwater control measures as the SCMs as established by Tennessee rule, blah, 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 and complying with other requirements of Tennessee rule, blah, blah, blah. For design purposes, total suspended solids may be used as the indicator for the reduction of pollutants. So the way TDEC has set up this standard is they have said that the maximum extent practicable is an 80% reduction of total suspended solids levels. Now, to your question about actual testing, they don't have to test their stormwater to show that 80% reduction. That will be accomplished, and you'll see in the slides to come here. That's accomplished through basically standard procedures, and you go through a calculation process to show, we are removing with these type stormwater control measures that we put in. Those are known to be able to reduce this amount.
So they've already done the testing, and so they know with these measures what will come out, yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
So stormwater control measures must be designed to provide full treatment capacity within 72 hours. That means that if you have a rain event and you're using infiltration, something like that, to meet these standards, that has to have done its job and be ready for the next storm event within 72 hours. So if you had back-to-back rain events, you're not going to get the same level of treatment on the second day, on back-to-back days, the second day that you would the first day.
When you say the rain falls and then within 72 hours, this of course is for normal rain events, not like this 5.5 and 30 minutes.
That's covered here as well within the standards, and you'll see that here very quickly. So within these standards, the water quality treatment design storm is the 1-year, 24-hour storm event as defined by, and it gives several options there of different sources that can be used to determine what that 1-year, 24-hour storm is here for Tullahoma. And then the water quality treatment volume, that WQTV, is a portion of the runoff generated just from impervious surfaces during that storm event. And that's where this becomes somewhat critical for the Planning Commission, because what developers are going to want to do to be able to better comply with these requirements and to reduce the amount of volume that they're having to treat is to reduce the amount of impervious area. And we'll talk a little bit about that briefly as well. So all of these slides, these standards I've been throwing out there, these are cut and paste straight from the permit into this presentation. We've done the same in this ordinance. Most of the red that you see in that ordinance is cut directly from the permit straight into your ordinance. So this walks through, and I'm not going to try to go through this entire table here, but this walks through, out of that 1-year, 24-hour design storm, this is kind of the incentives. If you use infiltration, evaporation, transpiration, or reuse, those are the things that TDEC really wants you to use. You only have to treat the first 1 inch of that design storm. As you go down the table, as you start to use controls that are a little bit less desirable, they require you to treat a higher level. when you get all the way to the bottom of this table, if you use the mechanical type controls that you mentioned, then you have to treat the entire amount of runoff generated from the storm. And, that's going to be, they've done it that way intentionally. TDEC has said, okay, we'll accept that. It does technically meet, the 80% TSS removal, but it's not what we really want to see. What we really want to see is runoff reduction and infiltration and those type of things. Where you're going to see those mechanical systems are your small commercial sites that just don't have room. You already have a couple of these in place in Tullahoma. You'll never see them because they're underground. What used to be the Bojangles and is now Highway 55, I guess, has one. It's underground. That whole parking lot is asphalt, so they really didn't have to do it. Bojangles, just as a company policy, any restaurants they put in now, they put in a water quality system, but they didn't have to do it at that time here. And I believe the Speedway has one. Speedway has one as well.
Does that collect and then eject into the stormwater drain?
Yes. It's a filter system that actually pulls out all of your solids and trash, and then it discharges typically directly into their detention. Then from there, sometimes they're filled the backside of the detention, but ideally, typically you want to see them on the front side of the detention as a pre-treatment mechanism.
And you may get into this, if you are, stop. So like Bojangles or 55 that's there now, it's all paved concrete because the city makes them do that, right? Speedway, because we have to pave. So is in some of this maybe considerations on how we need, like we mandate minimum number of parking spaces versus.
We're definitely going to get into that here in just a little bit. Those are definitely the type of things that the Planning Commission needs to be aware of and looking at and potentially change. Yes.
Okay. I figured I'd jump ahead.
So, who does the maintenance on that? Landowner, or is it?
They are required to do the maintenance. The city is required to make sure that they are doing the maintenance. So the city public works will have to actually have a tracking mechanism in place where they know where all of these are at and that they are making sure that they are being properly maintained. So there is definitely some, manpower requirements on the city as a result of this.
So Bojangles sits idle for a year or whatever. Is there a somewhere out of a pond or something is there a what's the long-term plan when that building is up? It's still paved and
well, it's you have you have a long-term maintenance plan that is required for these. The owner has to put together that plan. They submit it to the city. The city actually will record that plan along with the detention maintenance agreements, so that any subsequent owners of that property know, they can see that that plan exists, they can see that what that consists of. That's what the long-term maintenance plan does, is it's more than just the agreement. The agreement says, yes, if I own this property, I will be responsible for maintaining this system. The plan actually kind of spells out what that means. What does it take to maintain this system? So any subsequent purchaser of the property can see, hey, yes, if I buy this property, I'm also buying this responsibility.
Well, we're off topic, but that's good.
No, that's a part of this for sure. All right, just skip that slide there. For your information, we're talking about storm events there. According to one of those sources, the NOAA data, the 1-year 24-hour design storm for Tullahoma is 3.28 inches in a 24-hour period. You'll never need to know that.
I will remember it.
That's good.
That's a good fact.
There you go. So, getting in a little bit here to the ordinance, this is just the first page of the ordinance there. The idea behind this, the reason we're even doing this, what these standards are trying to accomplish that we've got in the ordinance is your parking lots, your streets, your developed areas are all sources of pollutants that tend to be flushed into the drainage system with the stormwater runoff. And it typically occurs, within the first little bit of the rain event, you get what they call the first flush. And once it's been raining for a while, your runoff is relatively clean. All of your pollutants have already flushed into the system. So it's trying to capture and eliminate oils and greases, litter, sediment, fertilizers, animal waste, those type of things from getting into your storm system and ultimately into the streams that your storm systems discharge into. So the preferred method of compliance with these standards is runoff reduction. Runoff reduction is a combination of infiltration, evapotranspiration, capture, and reuse. We went into all of those in a good bit of detail in that presentation that we did at the high school. We're not going to do that tonight. And then reduction of impervious surfaces. And this is where we get into those parking requirements and those type of things that play a part in this. So impervious area includes all areas that cannot absorb any amount of runoff, such as normal concrete and asphalt surfaces and normal rooftops. All rainfall that falls on impervious areas becomes runoff. Impervious areas can be reduced through methods already discussed, such as pervious pavement or green roofs. This is left from that previous presentation, so we really haven't discussed those tonight, or by design concepts such as narrower streets, modified cul-de-sacs, elimination of curb and gutter, reduced parking spaces. Now, I'm not saying, and don't misunderstand me, that the city has to do these things, that the city has to eliminate curb and gutter, or the city has to allow narrower streets. But these are things that may be approached about, and, the city may decide, no, our street standards, we're already as narrow as we need to be. Get garbage trucks or fire trucks down these streets, we don't need to go any narrower. Well, could you consider in some cases within a residential development a one-way street? Okay, then maybe you can narrow that up. Maybe you don't want that, but it's something that, would reduce the amount of impervious area. But, so I'm not saying you have to do these things, but these are things that you're liable to get questioned about by developers and say, hey, I'm trying to reduce my impervious area, reduce the amount of stormwater runoff so I can meet these standards. What can I do here? So modifying cul-de-sacs, reducing parking spaces are two of the easier things to accomplish. By modified cul-de-sacs, the pictures here is kind of what I'm referring to. Rather than paving the entire cul-de-sac, you leave the outer section there where your larger trucks can still turn around that radius, but the entire inner portion, could be left vegetated and possibly even be utilized as a stormwater infiltration area. If you direct some of the street water into that area. I don't know if your subdivision regulations would address this now, if they would already allow that, or if maybe there is some requirement in there that would stand in the way of that, but I don't know.
We can just carry cul-de-sacs there. Let's get some good streets.
So parking spaces, this is a big one. A lot of cities, as was mentioned just a few minutes ago, a lot of cities have a very boilerplate table of required parking spaces for different types of commercial establishments. And most of the cities that I see that in, there is nobody alive that can tell you where those numbers came from or why they are what they are. I have read articles on that very subject, and it appears that a lot of these have actually originated from some books out of California decades ago, that kind of became the norm across the country at points in time. So this is an area that, I think the city probably should look at and really look at. What you don't want to be doing is you don't want to be requiring more spaces than an entity needs just for the sake of meeting a number in a book, that you don't even know why it is there, so, because that does create more stormwater runoff. And, this is something that I helped the city of Lewisburg with on their parking standards. They went from several pages of tables of parking requirements to a very small little table that greatly reduced those minimum numbers. And what they've also done is to even still say, they put in there to where, say that their table says you have to have 23 spaces for this type of establishment. If the establishment comes in and says, hey, I know your requirement is 23, but we really only need 18. They will allow that establishment to construct 18 spaces. But based on the size of the building and based on their table, they make them show designated area where those other 5 could be constructed by a subsequent owner in the future if someone else comes in and buys that. They just show the space, they can leave it grass, they can't build a building on it, but they're not requiring an establishment to put in more spaces than they say they need just for the sake of meeting that table. On the flip side of that, they have a requirement on the high end also. And it says if you are proposing to put in 3 times the number that our table requires of you, you have to justify it. We're not saying you can't do it, but you have to justify it. We want to know that you put some thought into the number that you actually need. And that could be, done through, if you had a church and it seats X number of people or something, you could justify it through, here's the number of people we expect to be in the building. Or you could possibly, if it's a chain establishment, they could, potentially justify it through what they see in their other establishments in cities of similar size, So, but what we've seen a lot of in Lewisburg since doing that is we have had establishments come in and say, we don't need as many as your table says, so here's the designated area for somebody to build some more in the future, which has reduced asphalt. We've also seen some come in that the designers just simply filled every space they could with parking spaces because that's always a better thing, more is better. And they've exceeded that 3 times amount. So when we've asked them to give us the justification and they go back and actually talk to the owners about it, I think every time that has happened, rather than them giving the city justification, they've gone back and reduced the number of parking spaces that they were proposing and said, yeah, I guess we really don't need that. So that has worked well over there. I know the city of Shelbyville, they have a very similar table. They, several years ago, greatly reduced their required parking spaces. They don't do, I think, some of the other things I just described there, where they will allow, that you designate space but not construct them, and I don't think they have the requirement for the 3 times, having to justify it, but they have a similar number that they've gone to over there as well, and it's really worked well.
Why 3?
That was that was arbitrary. I can't sit here and even tell you exactly, that's been a few years ago. I don't remember exactly why that number was chosen, but
That just seems excessive in itself, like, you think maybe 180% or taking 200%.
yeah, and that would be fine. That was what they came up with over there, and it's worked fine for them. But if they had done 200%, it probably would have worked just as well.
Does that an ordinance change like that? Does that originate with the planning commission? Can it originate here and back, or how is that?
Well, technically, that's in the, was it zoning, so that would be in the zoning ordinance.
So start with PC, then come to.
They would recommend the changes to you guys, and then you guys would actually have to approve that ordinance change. You can certainly ask the PC to look at something, but the actual change would come from them and be a recommendation to you guys.
Probably got 2 parking spaces per resident still on there, I think.
Just at Walmart.
Well, and Walmart is the example that we often use in these presentations that we're trying to avoid, really.
Well, has anybody maybe disincentivized that by saying, hey, yep, you can go up to that many, but here's an impact. You're going to pay an impact fee for it.
I can't sit here and name a city that's done it. I don't doubt at all, but what that probably exists out there, and I think it's a great idea. But I can't give you a city off the top of my head that has done it in that manner. But you certainly could.
Do you see people use pervious solid surfaces to moderate some of those things?
Yes, and you're probably going to see some of that where you'll have some parking lots that will want to do pervious pavement, at least in parking stalls, maybe not within the drive aisles, that type of thing. Yes, that's going to become more common in trying to comply with these requirements as well as that, and in that table that we had up earlier that kind of spelled those things out, how you approach that and what amount of treatment you get really depends on your underlying soils. If you can really count on the soils underneath the asphalt to soak that water up and you don't have to have an underdrain, then you get a higher, higher credit, I guess is the good word. If you have to have the underdrain, then you still get some credit, but not as much.
Maintenance too, you'll see a lot of them have street sweeping, regular, so.
Well, there's education that goes along with that. I know of a parking lot that put in pervious asphalt, and then they came in years later and sealed the whole thing.
Yeah. Defeated the purpose.
Defeats the purpose. Clearing hurdles, and that's what we've been talking about here for the last several minutes, is, the permit actually does require a review of all documents dealing with stormwater, and that can be building codes, landscaping, street design, site layout, trees, probably others that I haven't named there.
Reviewed by who? Reviewed by who?
Well, staff, planning commission, whoever's responsible for the specific documents that may be involved. We actually went through this process in Tullahoma back in 2010 when this came up the first time, and we thought we were about to be implementing this. We actually went through the subdivision regulations, we went through the zoning ordinance, made several changes to those documents. They weren't, the way we handled it at the time was more of what I would consider a soft change. It was allowing the planning commission some flexibility rather than changing the standard in a hard change type manner. We added a lot of wording that allowed some flexibility in some of these areas so that the planning commission could allow some variances, in some of these areas if it was being done as a necessary necessary means of trying to meet the stormwater requirements. Now, since that time, you have a new zoning ordinance, you have I think, new subdivision regulations than what existed back then. So that process really needs to be gone through again. It doesn't necessarily have to, and it's not going to at this point, precede this ordinance being approved. It's something that you're going to see kind of evolve over time, and you're going to get a feel for what type of things are developers asking for. What are we seeing in Tullahoma that, they're really wanting to do and that we might need to change, that some of these things, the parking requirements, I'm all for taking a good hard look at that, and you just, for multiple reasons, stormwater quantity, quality, all of the above, you don't want to be forcing developers to come in and put more asphalt in than they even want just to meet some number in a table. So several areas of these documents may need to be revised to allow runoff reduction to occur, and we've hit on several of those. So how does runoff reduction impact the city? It can reduce construction costs if the city allows developers to reduce the impervious area rather than having to treat larger volumes of runoff. This results in less pollutants making it to the storm drains and to the receiving streams. This can result in reduced system maintenance. I think Eric could attest to the fact that Public Works Department spends a lot of time out there just cleaning out catch basins and, trying to keep storm drains open. This will help reduce what's getting to those to begin with. It's not going to eliminate it, but it will certainly help in those areas. Results in possible, and you see I've highlighted the word possible, improvements to flooding issues. Less runoff means less water volume to be handled during storm days. This can result in less strain on the drainage system and streams. However, that may not be and probably won't be recognized in large storm events. If you have areas that are experiencing flooding issues during even small storm events, this may help a little bit with that. When you get the really large events that go on for, many hours or a couple of days,
30 minutes.
Everything is saturated at that point to a fact that we're way beyond these volumes that we're talking about here. So you're not going to see a difference out of these stormwater quality requirements in those major flooding events. The last sentence there where you will possibly see some benefit is more so in redevelopment sites versus new development. If you had a large parking area that floods and that area gets redeveloped and then has to go in and meet these standards, then during those smaller events, you would see some benefit out of this, to flooding in those areas.
What triggers that threshold? I've been told that before, of redevelopment. Change of ownership, right? Change of use, change of ownership.
Yeah, change of use really is what I'm talking about there. If you had an area that,
It's a doctor's office and we'll switch to restaurant, right?
Well, or, when I say a large parking area, if you had a commercial complex of some sort that has become abandoned, old grocery store or something, and it's been abandoned there, and someone comes in and says, okay, we're going to tear that building down and do something completely different here, then they're definitely having to meet our rules.
We already talked about it all the months, we're talking about it again, but I mean, they've got more people in the city, I think.
Yeah.
But, it's like, that's a place that comes to mind.
Yeah, but it is packed.
Well, and
Saturday.
Part of what was done there would have fallen under what I'm referring to as redevelopment. You had, when the Publix went in, they did a lot of changing of parking areas there. You had a building out there within the parking area that went away. had these standards existed then they would have had to have done something there. You may see some benefit in those smaller storms from that. Again, when we get the really large storms, you're not going to, technically, there's probably still less water there, but you're not going to
You have to clean up the rains less, and everything's about 1-2% better. I mean, you're starting off in better condition.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. So.
You missed one.
All right. Flooding. As I said just a minute ago, flooding is impacted more by water quantity regulations than it is water quality regulations. What's in the ordinance in front of you is strictly new regulations on water quality. We have not changed any of the water quantity regulations. Now, you could do that at any time. You know, these water quality requirements that you see in red really need to be implemented by January 1st. If you guys, whether it be planning commission or city council, decided that you wanted to, look at other revisions to the stormwater ordinance, whether it be stormwater quantity or any other requirement in there that it can be changed, you can do that anytime, and that could happen immediately after these changes or, whatever needs to happen there. There are things in that ordinance that you can change. TDEC doesn't care at all about stormwater quantity. So what we have in the ordinance for stormwater quantity is what Tullahoma has required for years on detention. Those requirements are very much in line with other cities around Tullahoma, but you could change that all you wanted to. TDEC couldn't care less. They care about water quality. So there are other requirements in that ordinance that you can't change. Just like the requirements that we're proposing here that we put in front of you tonight, you really can't change these requirements. These are cut and pasted directly from the permit. So if you decided, hey, we want to be a little less strict than that 80% TSS standard, we want to go with 70. You can't do that. That wouldn't comply with the permit. If you wanted to be more strict, say, well, hey, we're going to go 90, and we're going to be the leaders. Well, that really doesn't fall in line with what has been determined to meet that maximum extent practical. And I think you would open yourself up to a similar lawsuit that what TDEC went through for 12 years. The basis of that lawsuit was the fact that these organizations that sued TDEC said you are being more strict with your standards than EPA, and you don't have the authority to do that. So if we decided to go more strict with some of these requirements, I think we would be opening ourselves up to a similar suit where they're saying, hey, you're now being more strict than TDEC and EPA. So these standards that are in the ordinance really aren't up for change. They are what they are. Where the city can have some control is in how you allow developers to go about complying with these requirements. So, ordinance revisions as drafted do not contain changes to detention requirements. The floodplain ordinance has also been drafted and in need of approval. As I started out earlier, giving you the background, this floodplain ordinance was actually revised back in 2020. I don't know why no action was taken on it at that time, but the reason we've got it in front of you now is if we were to approve these stormwater ordinance requirements, we have removed the floodplain requirements from that ordinance. So if you approve the stormwater ordinance only, then you would be in a position where you have no floodplain requirements on the books at that point. So it's important that the floodplain ordinance be approved either at the same time or before the stormwater ordinance. And our intent in giving you both is just to run through at the same time. Now the floodplain ordinance that you have in front of you is not changing the requirements in the city of Tullahoma at all. Now if you look at the current stormwater ordinance, you'll see that it's only a few pages of floodplain requirements. This document is much longer. This document is catching all, this is basically FEMA's boilerplate ordinance that they put out there as a recommended standard, with one exception. The one thing that, these are a minimum standard that FEMA puts out, with one exception. The one exception is Tullahoma requires a equal cut and fill within the floodplain. FEMA will allow unlimited amounts of fill in a floodplain, not a floodway, but in the floodplain. They don't recommend it, but they will allow it. What they recommend is that the city go above and beyond that minimum requirement and require equal cut and fill, meaning if somebody's going to go in and put in fill in the floodplain to build a building on or to build a parking lot on, they have to cut an equal amount of material out of the floodplain also. So the net change to the storage capacity is nil. And the idea there, ideally, you're actually taking that material and using it as your fill. Now that doesn't always work because you may not have suitable material. You know, if you're building a building on it, if you didn't have suitable material, you would have to remove material and haul it somewhere and put it in non-floodplain area. This also is not a change. The city of Tullahoma has been requiring that for many years now. But it is a little above and beyond FEMA's boilerplate floodplain management ordinance. So, and that's just showing the cover there of the floodplain management ordinance that you have in front of you. The first page, I should say. I think I have covered all of this and what I just explained, that it's not changing any requirements in Tullahoma. It's just making it a standalone document, which is more typical. Most cities do have a standalone document for a floodplain management ordinance. I can't say that we've really had any problems in Tullahoma with it being combined with the stormwater ordinance. It's just sometimes hard for developers or designers to locate because they don't think of looking at the stormwater ordinance for those requirements.
You might mention FEMA came in 20 and recommended, here's our new boilerplate ordinance, and at that point, many cities went and revised and adopted that boilerplate.
Yeah, and actually, the other cities that I work with, both Manchester and Lewisburg, we redid their board. They had standalone ordinances, but they were redone at around that same time frame as well. All right, to wrap up here, the city of Tullahoma has committed to TDEC to adopting post-construction stormwater requirements by January 1st of 2024. The floodplain management ordinance must be adopted either before or in conjunction with the stormwater management ordinance, or you risk being without floodplain requirements for some period of time there, and you don't want that. The city should consider reasonable ways to reduce impervious areas within new development. Thinking mainly in terms of those parking requirements that we discussed there. I know I've thrown a lot at you there in a relatively short period of time, but any further questions or discussions for me?
Does every municipality have to get the MS4 permit? And if not, then why are we special? That was in your first presentation. I think most of us weren't here for that.
All right, that's a good question. The answer to the first part of that is no. Not all cities have to be permitted under an MS4 permit. The way that it's laid out in the law from EPA, it's actually based on population density. If you have areas within your jurisdiction that are considered urban areas from a population density standpoint, you have to be permitted. Then, and Tullahoma does not, then there's a caveat to that. If you have a population of greater than 10,000, just straight population, EPA requires the state to evaluate you to determine whether or not you should be permitted. That's where Tullahoma fell into this. You were over 10,000. TDEC evaluated you. This goes all the way back to the 2003 timeframe when the permit first came out. Because Rock Creek that flows right through the middle of Tullahoma is impaired for sedimentation, they said, yes, you should be included. Shelbyville was included for the same reason. They were evaluated because of the Duck River flowing right through there. Yes, that evaluation said they should be included. Lewisburg, same reason. Manchester, when you first got permitted in 2003, well, the draft was 2003, your actual first permit came in 2004, but at that time, Manchester had not exceeded 10,000, so they didn't get evaluated. After the 2010 census, they broke 10,000, which they thought was a good thing. And then they quickly got a letter from TDEC saying, welcome to the family. So they were evaluated, again, because of the Duck River, little Duck River there. They were included in the program. Winchester, I'm not sure what the population of Winchester is, if they're over 10,000, but if they are, they have not been included. They are not in MS4. Most cities of your size, when TDEC does the evaluation, they welcome them to the family and say, yes, you are going to be an MS4 permittee. The city had no choice in that matter. It certainly was not something that the city just, almost 20 years ago now decided, hey, we should do this. Sounds fun. Now, there are some good things in this that come out of this, but there are also parts of it that are more headache than they are anything else. So, and some cities that are not designated as MS4 do some of these things, but they have the luxury of picking and choosing what they do and not having to do all of it, so that they don't end up becoming an
Any other questions for Mr. Patterson?
I'd like to ask, if it's okay, since we're talking about flooding and everything such, I'd like to ask Mr. St. John about the questions we had brought up about the property off of Voca. I saw the engineering report that talked about that they thought they could collect water, all go down to the basin, and then it would flow underneath the Voca. And my concern back then was, and I get to ask it fully to you or get an answer from you about all that water's coming off that's already there before that property gets developed, and then when it gets developed, it's going to all still go down through there underneath the Voca. How do we consider existing and new development when we can look at the water flow out of all that side across underneath the Voca on out to the lake?
Make sure I'm
It's the no, not that one, but out there where they're going to put the Springbrook. Yeah, they're going to add. They already have a problem now with water overflowing, and it goes underneath Avoca Road, out to the lake. But now if they put that other property there, it's going to be more additional water. And I was concerned about how that was going to all flow through underneath the road and not flood over the road.
So we've seen some preliminary calculations through the engineer there. We asked for them to run in to help evaluate that preliminary plan. So they've run contingency calculations already. They haven't put it on firm grading plan yet. We'll see that in construction plans, but they've already committed to over-detaining and more than even 25-year storm event that DC required to propose in 100-year. So in that basin area that is right before it discharges offside and goes under, I'm on the right location. Okay. So that is to over-detain, to release less than what is coming here now.
Okay, so you've included what's already present, plus they're going to try to reduce what will be adding to that's going through and release it in a slower fashion to not overflow into Avoca then.
That's right.
And as a matter of fact, at that where you're speaking of, water has never overflowed the road there. With what it is now, and they're proposing to reduce that flow, so there's no chance of it overflowing the road.
But we also look at the calculations, make sure it's velocity, make sure there's not corrosion, so it's not just detention. Then, within their development, all of their storm piping, all of their drainage systems have to handle at least a 25-year storm event as well. So we'll see all those calculations at the construction plan.
Well, some of these new regulations that we're talking about apply since that plat was already submitted?
They will not.
They will not.
Anything that has already been approved or is even in the submittal process won't be required to meet these requirements. Once this ordinance is approved, then anything new that comes into the city at that point in time will have to meet the requirements.
Just like the mixed-use development we're talking about, it's going to be a large area, it's not going to be applicable to any of that either, then, right?
Well, they've not, they are in the talking stages. They have not really submitted a plan for approval at this point, so they could. It really kind of depends on the timing. It could go either way on that one.
So because they have submitted the rezone, but because they haven't done like actual plats.
Correct.
Okay.
So that was going to depend on timing. And, if they... Yeah, I mean, that's the important thing, even with detention, to understand that if you have an area out there that is flooding, your typical detention requirements are just making sure that their flow rates post-construction are no greater than they were pre-construction. And you require that through a 25-year storm. Now, oftentimes, you'll see that just by the nature of what they construct to do this, they actually detain for larger storm events than what's required. Oftentimes, even though they're only required to detain for the 25, when you see the calculations, they're actually detaining to 100 also. It sounds like in this case, they have agreed to make sure that that's the case, but if you had a flooding issue there, if that culvert were overtopping the road, you're not going to see a development coming in and doing detention solve that problem. It's not going to contribute any and make it any worse, but it's not going to solve the problem. Not unless you went much stricter with your regulations and said, okay, we're going to go above and beyond and say, not only are you going to just meet what you were doing prior to development, you're going to cut it in half, which I don't know of any cities that have ever attempted to do that, but there may be some out there somewhere.
But in the same breath, we sit down with them on the Friday night, and we've already, done that and say, hey, here's the problem of the area. Help us lean to the conservative side and help make changes. So, that's what
Always push the over the tank.
it's just not 25. They just get on 2, 5, 25, and 100. So even at small events, have an impact on those people. And so we make sure they're paying for the small events. And that gets into changing the outlet structure type and on the small through the big event.
Part of what EPA is trying to accomplish with these water quality requirements, though, is what we're talking about here, and I think you understand, you made the point there, we're talking about flow rate being reduced to pre-development levels, but the fact is they are actually discharging more water. There is more volume generated. That's why the detention basin is having to hold that volume back and release it at a slower rate. EPA has done studies, and it's really not so much about the infrastructure of the system. The pipes are going to carry what they're going to carry, but they've seen that even that increased volume over an increased period of time, even though it's not at a greater flow rate, does have some detrimental effects to the receiving streams when it comes to erosion. that's part of what they're trying to help and overcome with these runoff retention lines also, is to reduce that overall volume that's being discharged to the receiving stream, down below the development.
Since there are no other questions.
I have one real quick. It's real quick, I promise. We're getting into fall, and it's kind of getting into hearty soup weather, and there's a diverse crowd here, so there may be an answer. There's this stuff that my mother used to make. It's like in a white bisque, and it's got oyster clams, and what's the name of that?
Boss ass, it's clam chowder.
Chowder, okay. That's right. I figured there might be somebody in here who could help me with that.
I know where that's coming from, I believe. I may be wrong, but I believe I know where it's coming from.
Being adjourned.